All right. Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Johnson, and I serve on the English faculty here, and I direct First Lake Water, the visiting poet program of Central Lakes College. Thank you so much for coming. I have a small introduction in my pretentious little binder here, but I always got to start out with business notes. First, a little prop to remind you to do the right thing. With the mobiles, we hate to have poetry interrupted by rings. And thanks for doing that. We convened today to hear Ellen Bryant Voigt read poetry. Ellen's going to read for 45 minutes, and after that, we're going to have a book signing meet and greet up in the lobby out there. We have 3 of her titles that you can buy and have her sign and take them home to remember the day by. We distributed some little cards too, a survey card to see what you think of the reading, and we also distributed a card that you can put your email address on if you'd like to be apprised of future events. For my introduction, I also want to thank from my heart Five Wings Arts Council and Minnesota Public Radio for sponsoring this poetry event. And, where'd we get Pine River tucked in? Are you guys here? Nice. On this cold October morning, we gather to encounter and celebrate the poetry of Ellen Bryant Voigt. To nudge us forward, I return in thought to the writer who helped us begin this series 6 falls ago, Lee Young Lee. Lee Young proposes that we conceive of all poems as projections that reflect the mind and heart and imagination of their creator, just as each and every one of us is a projection, reflecting the consciousness of our creator with importance and meaning few of us understand. If you pick up one of Ellen's books of poetry, you will behold reflections of what appear to be familiar things we live with all our days. Birds and flowers, stars, tiny children, gravestones with family names and dates that measure the span and call of stories. The same wind that is buffeting our region today is blowing through these poems, but if you reread them again and again as I have, you'll notice something more, something ancient. The voice of a woman who was at once an artist, a parent, a wife, and perhaps above all, a gifted teacher who is bidding us to stop taking for granted the gift of being alive and to truly pay attention to the things that matter in this world. I'm mixing metaphors again, like any English major at a community college, but as we move towards hearing some of these poems, we can think about all the children of the world who have sat at the foot of their mothers while they embroider. From the child's perspective, the canvas is a mad tangle of colored yarn that appears to be a mess. Late in the afternoon, when the light is getting thin, the mother turns the surface of the dream towards the child so they can say, "Okay, that is what you've been up to. I understand now." Reading poems can be like that, like witnessing a tapestry whose edges enclose the universe. And whether we fully get it or not, my life in literature has taught me that the only appropriate stance towards America's great poets is gratitude. Thank you, Ellen, for writing these books, for coming to Minnesota, and for calling us to take up imaginative literature and be readers. Let's offer a warm Minnesota welcome to Ellen Bryant Voigt.
Thank you. Thanks for coming today. I'll leave it up to George to crank this up if it's not loud enough. And just wave your hand if you can't hear, and then George will fix it in the booth. Oh, good. They took that away. Here's a little poem called Milkmaid. White froth overnight on bare ground, brown leaves. No yellow bus on the snow-slicked road. So I could help my father deliver the mail, his other job. Began at 6, finish at 2, then farm. My part was laboring through the drifts toward the red flag, the withers flag, meant dried apple pies, fried pockets of fruit to sweeten his usual bitter thermos, his usual 2 sandwiches, 1 butter sliced in a slab, the peasant's cheese, 1 meat, maybe head cheese, the leftover parts of pig, snow days. I wore his fishing boots rolled at my waist. I waded to the metal box, put something in, took something out. I still believe getting the mail is the best part of the day. My beloved disagrees. He says he has enough bad news, but what about finding among the trash a piece of smooth beach glass? Today, a postcard. A milkmaid's royal blue emphatic apron, not dulled by many washings, not stained by milk or mud, the blue Vermeer's ennoblement. He lets her pour a pure white stream from the lip of the pitcher into the earth-brown bowl. What's rich has been set aside for butter or cheese. What's left, enough to soften the week's stale bread, a peasant's Sunday supper, milk soup, my father's favorite. Oh, thank you. Do you have milk soup in Minnesota? No? Okay, here's another one with kind of food in it, or potential food in it. Can you tell? We just came from brunch. Just had brunch down the hall down there. This is called the hen. The neck lodged under a stick, the stick under her foot. She held the full white breast with both hands, yanked up and out, and the head was delivered of the body. Brain stuck like a lens, the profile fringed with red feathers. Deposed, abstracted, the head lay on the ground like a coin, but the rest released into the yard, language and direction wrung from it, flapped the insufficient wings and staggered forward, convulsed, instinctive. I thought it was sobbing to see it hump the dust, pulsing out those muddy juices as if something deep in the gizzard, in the sack of soft nuggets, drove it toward the amputated member. Even then, watching it litter the ground with snowy refusals, I knew it was this that held life, gave life, and not the head with its hard, contemplative eye. I appreciate any sound you make after I finish a poem so that I know that you're out there. So if you liked it and you want to clap, then that's great. If you'd rather cough, then that's okay too. That's fine. Okay, I'm going to grow that speaker up just a little bit. This is a poem called Privet Hedge. First, frail green in the northeast, the forest around us no longer, a postcard of Christmas snow clotting the spruce, or worse, falls, technicolor beaches, sumac, sugar maple, death. Even the death of vegetation should never be so beautiful. It is unseemly. I prefer the cusps. They focus the mind, which otherwise stays distracted, knowing things. When my friend said, knowledge does nothing for him, I felt at once superior and chastised. I'd just deduced the 5 new birds in my yard, woodpecker size and stripes and red blaze, but feeding on the ground. 5 yellow-shafted flickers. Can the soul be known by its song? Who hears it? What keeps it aloft? What keeps it whole? What helps it survive habitual pride, greed, wrath, sloth, lust, a list compiled by a parent always needing something to forgive you for? I meant to ask the nuns to straighten this out for me while I was among them in Minnesota, their earlier spring. But I couldn't guess which ones they are. They dress like everyone else, no veils, no starched white, no kneeling boards. I was left on my own to study the graveyard behind the Privet Hedge. Their markers, all alike, as on a battlefield, immense and calm, beneath an open Midwestern sky, nothing between the pilgrim and the scoured horizon. I was down at St. Ben's. I was here, I think it must have been about 8 years ago, and had a week down at St. Benedict's. And that's their graveyard down there. You should take a look. It's inspirational. I'm going to read you a couple of narratives, poems that try to tell a story, and introduce some characters to you that then will recur in another guise. So, this poem is called "The Farmer." I was down in Avon yesterday. They're out cutting in the fields, right? That harvester was out at work, still bringing it in. Farmer. In the still blistering late afternoon, like hurrying a horse, the rake circled the meadow, the cut grass ridging behind it. This summer, if the weather held, he'd risk a second harvest after years of reinvesting, leaving fallow. These fields were why he farmed. He walked the fence line like a man in love. The animals were merely what he needed: cattle and pigs, chickens for a while, a dray horse, saddle horses he was paid to pasture, an endless, stupid round of animals, one of them always hungry, sick, lost, calving or farrowing or waiting slaughter. When the field began dissolving in the dusk, he carried feed down to the knoll, its clump of pines, gate, trough, lick, shoot, and 2 gray hives, leaned into the Jersey side as the galvanized bucket filled with milk, released the cow, and turned to the bees. He'd taken honey before without protection. This time, they could smell something in his sweat: fatigue, impatience, although he was a stubborn, patient man. Suddenly, like flame, they were swarming over him. He rolled in the dirt, manure, and stiff hoof prints, started back up the path, rolled in the fresh hay, refused to run, which would have pumped the venom through him faster, past the oaks at the yard's edge, rolled in the yard, reached the kitchen, and when he tore off his clothes, crushed bees dropped from him like scabs. For a week he lay in the darkened bedroom. The doctor stopped by twice a day, the 100 stings, enough to kill an ox, enough to kill a younger man. What saved him were the years of smaller doses, like minor disappointments, instructive poison, something he could use. Now, this next one is the same guy in my head. The same guy, but seen from a different angle, so the point of view changes. And this one, a little bit less of a narrative, a little bit less of a story in which things are happening and will have some kind of consequence. And this one is called Amaryllis. You know what that is, right? That's that plant that your great aunt has out on the three-season porch. It's that one with it has the fountain of leaves and then that very phallic blossom that comes right up there in the middle with the two things. Yeah, it's also the name of the happy little milkmaid in the pastorals. Amaryllis. Having been a farmer's daughter, she didn't want to be a farmer's wife. Didn't want the smell of ripe manure in all his clothes, the corresponding flies in her kitchen, a pail of slop below the sink, a crate of baby chicks beside the stove, piping beneath their bare light bulb, cows calling at the gate for him to come, cows standing in the chute as he crops their horns with his long, sharp shears. So she nagged him toward a job in town. So she sprang from the table, weeping when he swore. So, after supper, she sulks over her mending as he unfolds his pearl pocket knife to trim a callus on his palm. Too much like her mother, he says, not knowing any other reason why she spoils the children, or why he comes in from the combine with his wrenches to find potatoes boiled dry in their pot, his wife in the parlor on the bench at her oak piano, not playing, you understand, just sitting like a fern in that formal room. So much time to think these long hours. Like her mother, each night she goes to bed when her husband's tired, gets up when he gets up, and in between tries not to move, listening to the sleep of this good man who lies beside and over her. So much time alone, since everything he knows is practical. Just this morning, he plunged an ice pick into the bloated side of the cow, unable to rise, dying where it fell, its several stomachs having failed. Too full, he said, of sweet, wet clover. I read that poem one time. Thanks. I read that poem one time at the Donnell Library in New York City. And at the end of the reading, a nice gentleman came up and was chatting with me afterwards and said that he had liked some of the poems that I read, but he certainly did not like the poem about the cow murderer. So ever since then, I've been a little hesitant to even read it, and certainly not read it in the city without explaining that he's trying to save the life of the cow. But I figure in Minnesota, you know that, right? You know he's trying to save the life of the cow. Or maybe you've read Thomas Hardy, and so you know that happens in Thomas Hardy too. In fact, for the sheep, they have a special tool. I forget the name of it, but what I know about it is an ice pick that will come in handy. All right, one more in this little batch. My narratives and quasi-narratives. This one even less of a story. Okay, I'm kind of trying to push you toward more lyric poems coming up. These are also pretty much all poems that use a regular meter. And that's the very common one in our language, the common one for our language, which is iambic pentameter. And the reason it's so common is because it accommodates the English sentence really quite nicely. Okay, so let me give you this one. This is called Nightshade. The dog lay under the house, having crawled back beyond the porch, bellying beneath the joists, through rocks and red dirt, to the cool stone foundation where it died, as the children called and sobbed. And now their father had to wrench it out, the one he had been breaking to handle birds. This was a man of strictest moderation, who had heard a dash of strychnine in its meat could be a tonic for a dog, an extra edge. He loved that dog and got the dosage wrong. And I loved my father. I was among the children looking on, and for years would not forgive him. Without pure evil in the world, there was no east or west, no pole star, and no ratifying dove. I sat inside the small White House for hours, deaf to the world, playing my two songs, one in a major, the other in a sad minor key. Okay, now I want you to hear a different sound. If in fact that iambic pentameter, which you will remember from your classes, that's about having these 5 beats, pretty steady, and then we get a new line, and that's what poets get to do. Poets get to have a second rhythmic system. We have the rhythm that exists in the language, and then we get to make another one, and we make it out of whole cloth. Every time, every poem, every line, and you can choose to have a pattern in that sound of the line. So what I've been reading to you has been this more kind of lopey, a more accommodating kind of line that can take care of narrative information. You don't have to do that. You can also make it jazzy. You can go against that. You can throw some kind of contradiction. Use the line to play off in a syncopation with the existing rhythm of the sentence. So I'm just going to read you a couple of, again, the same concerns and some of the same characters, but coming to you in a different sound, a different song, if it were. Okay. Whenever my mother, who taught small children 40 years, asked a question, she already knew the answer. Would you like to meant you would. Shall we was another, and don't you think, as in, don't you think it's time you cut your hair? So when, in the bare room, in the strict bed, she said, you want to see? Her hands were busy at her neckline, untying the robe, not looking down at it, stitches bristling where the breast had been, but straight at me. I did what I always did, not weep. She never wept, and made my face a freshly whitewashed wall. Let her write again whatever she wanted there. You can hear that difference, right? So here's another one. It's a short line. When you do a short line, it's very likely that you are going to go against the rhythm of the sentence. So that poem is called Lesson. This poem is called Practice. To weep unbidden, to wake at night in order to weep, to wait for the whisker on the face of the clock to twitch again, moving the dumb day forward. Is this merely practice? Some believe in heaven, some in rest. We'll float, you said. Afterward, we'll float between two worlds. 5 bronze beetles stacked like spoons in one peony blossom, drugged by lust. If I came back as a bird, I'd remember that. We'll float until everyone we love is safe, is what you said. Okay. So now here's another sound. This is the newest sound from Headwaters. And in this book, there's no punctuation, which is to say you don't get to stop and take a breath until I tell you you can, which is at the end of the line, which is visual, right? You're just going to run into that white space. So there it is. And by that time, you might be panting a little bit too because the lines are kind of long. So that's what I'm up to here, and it's you'll hear. It's a slightly different song. So this is called Geese. Saw some headed south on the way over this morning. Geese. There is no cure for temperament. It's how we recognize ourselves, but sometimes within it, a narrowing imprisons or is opened, such as when my mother, in her last illness, snarled and spat, and how this lifted my dear father into a patient tenderness, thereby astounding everyone. But mostly it hardens who we always were. If you've been, let's say, a glass half empty kind of girl, you wake to the chorus of geese overhead, forlorn, for something has softened their nasal voices, their ugly aggression on the ground. They're worse than chickens, but flying, one leader falling back, another moving up to pierce the wind. No one in charge, or everyone in charge, in flight, each limited goose adjusts its part in the cluster just under the clouds. Do they mean together to duplicate the cloud? Like the pelicans on the pond, rearranging their shadows to fool the fish, another collective that constantly recalibrates. But fish don't need to reinvent themselves the way geese do when they negotiate the sky. On the fixed, unyielding ground, there is no end to hierarchy. The flock, the pack, the family, you know it's true. If you're a take charge kind of girl, I recommend houseplants in the windows facing south. The cacti, the cyclamen are blooming on the brink of winter. All it took was a little enforced deprivation, a little premature and structured dark. Thank you for that laugh. Thank you. Moles. You have those up here, I'm sure, right? The kind on the ground, not the kind on the side of your face. Right? Moles. Where is his hat? Where is his horse? Where is his harrier? My beloved is distraught. He made this yard, each blade, each stem, each stalk, except the mounds of fresh dirt like little graves. It's moles that make the mounds when they make holes. They are worms with fur. The cat does not do moles. She's stalking rooks and mice. Beloved has scattered human hair across the sod. It keeps the deer away. He has installed a high-pitched hum in the lily bed. It keeps the dogs out of the yard who might have otherwise unearthed a mole. Too bad. Traps don't work the way they do for squirrels. My father used to thrust the hose into one hole and flood them out. My beloved does not care what my father did. This greensward is his joy, his job. My job was children, food, house. The rest of what I did stayed underground. All right, another underground creature. If you have a good Minnesota way of getting rid of moles, by the way, please tell me afterwards. Groundhog. Not unlike otters, which we love, frolicking, floating on their backs like truant boys unwrapping lunch. Same sleek brown pelt, some overtones of gray and rust, though groundhogs have no swimming hole, and lunch is rooted in the ground beneath short legs, small feet, like a fat man's odd diminutive loafers. Not frolicking, but scurrying layers of fat. His coat gleams as though wet, shines chestnut sable, darker head and muzzle lower into the grass, a dark triangular face like the hog-nosed skunk, another delicate nose and not a snout. Doesn't it matter what they're called? I like swine, which are smart and prefer to be clean, using their snouts to push their excrement to the side of the pen. But they have hairy skin, not fur. His fur shimmers and ripples. He never uproots the mother plant. His teeth, I think, are blunt, squared off like a sheep's. If cornered, does he cower like sheep or bite like a sow with a litter? Is he ever attacked? He looks to me inedible. He shares his acreage with moles, voles, ravenous crows. Someone thought up the names. His other name is Botched Algonquin, but yes, he burrows beneath the barn where a farmer once dried cord wood. He scuttles there, his speech, cough, laugh. At lawnmower, swollen brook, high wind, he lifts his head as Gandhi did, small tilt to the side, or stands erect like a prairie dog or a circus dog, but dogs don't waddle like Mao with a tiny tail. He seems asexual like Gandhi, like Jesus. If Jesus came back, would he be vegetarian? Also, pinko, frico, homo? In Vermont, natives scornful of greyhounds from the city self-appoint themselves woodchucks, unkempt, hairy, macho, who would shoot on sight an actual fatso, shy, mild marmot, radiant as the hog-nosed skunk in the squirrel trap, both cleaner than sheep, fur fluffy like a girl's. Maybe he is a she. It matters what we're called. Words shape the thought. Don't say rodent and ruin everything. Okay, so now here's a piece of a narrative. Here's going back to a kind of story poem, but without that that song sound that I read to you before. And this is a poem called Noble Dog. Behind our house, down to the brook and the woods, beyond the groomed grass and flower beds, what we see are brook and woods and sometimes mild creatures of the field. We thought when we bathed in the claw-footed tub we could pretend we stayed inside the natural world, no shutters, no shades. At night, beside the mirror over the sink, the windows darkened into mirrors, where my daughter at 13 admired her tan, her new body, until she felt or thought she felt something move outside in the yard and asked quietly up the back stairs for us to come down here for just a minute, please. Come down here now. We couldn't tell how much was fear, how much was shame. We thought she needed us to be calm. We tried to be calm, like the trooper we called, who said without alarm to the handsome, noble dog, "Where is he, buddy? Where is he, buddy?" At which As if in a game of fetch, the dog went straight around the house to the one smell that didn't fit, the one smell that crossed the clipped grass into the ditch beside the dirt road where the dog went to, the dog tracking the smell, the trooper tracking the dog not barking or baying until the scent stopped inside the culvert bearing the brook west under the road, a large metal pipe that amplified the dog's whimpers and moans. Dog of righteousness, dog of retribution. We heard it from our house, where soon the shutters would go up. We sat in the kitchen, the summer air soft as a damp rag. We knew this was a moment of consequence, but we couldn't tell whether the world had grown larger or smaller. I was glad to see that little bit of snow out there this morning. We've had just only a flurry in Vermont, nothing. I mean, didn't even whiten the ground, doesn't count. So October 30th and not to have had snow is very, very strange and disturbing. It's very disturbing. I fear we have messed up the planet, and we're just beginning to pay for it. This is a poem called Roof that you'll probably appreciate here in northern Minnesota, where you have no dearth of snow, right? Roof. After a week of daily heavy snow, I want to praise my roof. First, the acute angle at which it descends from the ridgepole, and second, that it is black, the color absorbing all the other colors, so that even now, as Arctic air blows in from the plains, my roof burns off from underneath the dazzling snow, dense layers of particles, which are tiny specks of trash sheathed in wet cloud. What chance do they have against my roof? Even at night, the snowpack over my head breaks apart and slides on its own, melting down from the eaves, as though my roof had shrugged. I hear snow thump to the ground, a cleansing sound. The secret of my roof is standing seams, the raised ridges bonding the separate panels to one another, an old wound that has healed, no lapped shingles catching the wind, no ice jam at the eaves, no sending my beloved out with an axe, no roof caved in from the weight of snow as happened in 1924, only another thump as a slab of snow lets loose, leaving my roof gleaming in the wet residue. It takes what it needs from the life source and sheds the rest, a useful example if I were starting over. Okay. So how about if I do, I'll do 2 more poems, then we'll do something else. This is called Owl. The sign for making the most of what you have on the human hand is a thumb at full right angle to the palm. For the owl, it's 2 talons forward, 2 back, a flexible foot that crushes the prey and lifts it to the beak, to the eyes, which are legally blind. This is why the owl hunts in the dark, in the dusk, when nothing is clearly seen, and why the owl's eyes are fixed, facing ahead to better focus. So its whole face swivels in each direction like the turret on a tank. The round plates of feathers surrounding the eyes collect the least sound. When it turns, the owl is computing by geometry the exact location of the mouse or snake or songbird that moves imperceptibly in its nest toward which the owl sets out from the hole in the tree, the burrow, the eave of the barn, and crosses the field in utter silence, wing feathers overlapped to make no sound. Poor mouse, poor rabbit. Last night, from the porch obbligato to the brook and the snuffling deer, intent on the gnarled, worm-bitten apples we leave on the tree, I heard what must have been a barred owl, or a barn owl, or a lesser horned owl, not deep in the woods, close by. What I heard was less a call than a cry, a fragment repeating, a kind of shudder, which may be why the country people I come from thought an owl was prescient, ill omen, meant to unspool the threads they'd gathered and wound. I was a grown woman when my father took the key from under the eave and unlocked the door to the darkened house he had grown up in, and stepped across the threshold and said as he entered the empty room, "Hello, Miss Sally," as though his stepmother, dead for weeks, were still in her usual chair. In the medicine wheel, the emblem for wisdom is the same for gratitude. At dusk, at dark, the far-sighted owl strikes in utter silence. When we hear it from the tree or the barn, what it announces is already finished. Your ghost story for Halloween. It's nice to see all the tamaracks with their leaves turning yellow. We have those in Vermont also, although the common name for them in Vermont is larch. They call them larch rather than tamaracks or hackmatax, but it's the same tree. And this last poem is called Larch. Short sleeves in Vermont, late November, the leaves long gone, only evergreens, the white birch bark and our feral black cat, not sheltering, prowling improbably in her thickened coat. One more free-range lunch, one more of her 9 lives, put back into reserve, unlike the year's fresh deaths. As for me, I keep my votive candles burning as the larches burned on the hillside, their needles yellow, deciduous like the leaves, and now sloughed in the yard beside the small larch, bent double, cascading like a willow. Weeping is the proper name for it. Also for the cherry tree in the yard of the house where my parents' friend shot an intruder. It was his wife. Their tree might as well be here with all my other lost trees, childhood mimosas, magnolias, the willow oak blown down in a storm, surviving in my head, beside the friend, the murdered wife, the subsequent wife, my parents too, and now Peter with his lazy eye, and glamorous, doom-ridden Wren, and Carol, who had her own reprieves, who used them up. I confess, the weather matters more and more to me. Diurnal is a lovely word. Another is circadian. Thanks for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. We'll have a book signing now, and at 1:30 here, we'll reconvene for a craft talk if you can stay for that. Give your cards to the ushers, or you can put them on the table out there with our bookstore people selling books. Hope to see some of you here in January when we host the Syrian refugee Osama Alamar. Thank you so much for coming.